just say that this person originated in Iran, or I'm assuming we don't have access to their databases, we don't have access to their biometrics. So let's say this individual is, a male in his 20s from Iran, comes into the United States, says, my name's John Doe, I was born January 1st, 2000. Do you have the ability to disprove that?
If, in that particular instance, we would work with the RO and turn that individual.
Excuse me, with whom?
Enforcement and removal operations, ICE.
So you would remove that individual?
We would turn that individual over to ICE, and that person would go through the proceedings.
Are you aware if there's any data to show that illegal entries are higher or lower on lands that have a threat of apex predators?
Matter of fact, I want you to have more money than that.
Why in the world would they ask to cut detention beds?
I'm here representing Customs and Border Protection, sir.
Subject of today's hearing is the fiscal year 2025 budget request for U.S. Customs and Border Protection. I would like to thank our witness, Mr. Commissioner, for being here.
We need to do whatever we need to do at the 1 yard line called the Mexico border, U.S.-Mexico border. But I think it's key that we continue, and I know you've been involved in some of those conversations. So if you can talk about that and then talk about, Mr. Chairman, members, maybe some authority that could help you work with the Mexicans. We'll work with the State Department, but if you can talk about some authorities that would help you work with Mexico better to continue this work.
Thank you for the question, and what you outlined from 24 is very much appreciated. The committee, the subcommittee, the funding, especially for taking care of the base pay and some of those issues that you just outlined. So it's very important for 2024. You're 100% right. We work very closely with our colleagues, not only in Mexico, but South America, Central America. We've been working real hard with the Department of State, with the Eastern Hemisphere as well, looking at transit visa requirements to enter this hemisphere, number one. Number two, working very closely with our partners in Guatemala, Panama, El Salvador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, up into Mexico. And I have a individual, a senior advisor assigned to me that is solely dedicated to working with Mexico. So we're in constant communication, daily communication with Mexico, talking about what we're seeing, sharing intelligence, talking about what we're seeing in between the ports, what the trends are, what sectors are busy, what nationalities we're seeing, and Mexico is taking that back and an action in that through checkpoint operations, as you pointed out, removing people south to their southern border and repatriating more people than they have in the past. As far as the authorities that we would need, that's something I would have to get back to you and talk to you at a later stage. But certainly, there's a couple things that we could work with you on.
If an individual comes into the country with no form of identification and they just give a name and they give a birth date, that unless you can disprove that that's who they are, that they're admitted into the country with a piece of paper that has that name and that birth date, is that still the way was my understanding correct in January? Is that still the way business is conducted?
First and foremost, we work very closely, as I stated to the ranking member, with our foreign partners in South and Central America on information sharing agreements to share information back and forth on who's coming into the hemisphere. We work very closely also with our foreign partners on biometrics as they move throughout the hemisphere. And when they enter in between the ports of entry, we, of course, will run biometrics. We'll run biographics. We will do our complete suite of checks against law enforcement databases, intelligence databases, our databases. And ultimately, it is our goal to remove individuals quickly that don't have an asylum claim.
Well, let's just say that this person originated in Iran, or I'm assuming we don't have access to their databases, we don't have access to their biometrics. So let's say this individual is, a male in his 20s from Iran, comes in the United States, says, my name's John Doe, I was born January 1st, 2000. Do you have the ability to disprove that?
If, in that particular instance, we would work with the RO and turn that individual,
Excuse me, with whom?
enforcement and removal operations, ICE.
So you would remove that individual?
We would turn that individual over to ICE, and that person would go through the proceedings.
So what individual, and I guess I don't understand this, because I'm told that you can come into the country without an ID and be released into the interior. So how would that individual be any different? I mean, they're not going to tell you they came from Iran. They're going to tell you they came from some other country, but they originate in Iran, so all their biometric data, their ID data, law enforcement data, it's all in Iran. So why would that person be removed? Why would that person be removed and not someone else coming in with who doesn't have a form of ID?
So again, as I explained, we have information sharing agreements with countries throughout the hemisphere. That individual had to get in the hemisphere using some sort of travel document on an airline with some sort of manifest information. So that's where the process starts, and the process starts throughout the hemisphere, goes throughout the hemisphere. And as the individual is encountered, we'll do a risk assessment on every single individual. As I stated, our goal is, given the capability, to turn that individual over to ICE for removal proceedings.
So let's say that person comes into Venezuela, where I assume we don't have a whole lot of agreements with them. How would we, I just don't understand, how is that person different from anyone else? I mean, they come in, they don't tell you they're from Iran, they can't come through Venezuela, which is not a friendly nation to us. I'm assuming we don't have extensive information data sharing with Venezuela. So you can confidently say that Iran is not smuggling people into this country through a system where if somebody has no identification, they won't be allowed entrance into this country. You can confidently say that.
I can confidently say we're doing our best to identify every single individual coming into this country and vet them through appropriate systems.
But if no red flags come up on that individual somewhere, that person will be admitted into the interior. That was my understanding, again, from what I was told at the border in January.
He or she will not be admitted into the interior.
With no red flags. I mean, no red flags come up anywhere. No red flags come from all this information sharing. So we're not admitting people into the interior who don't have identification.
Admit would be the wrong terminology. We could release somebody with a notice to appear.
Oh, a notice to appear. Okay, so we would be counting on this young Iranian to basically show up somewhere at a office in the interior after they're released into the interior. That sounds like a plan that's pretty dangerous. I yield back.
No, actually, we would be counting on our vetting and information sharing agreements to identify that information and put them in the appropriate pathway.
What changes has CBP made to improve oversight of its existing medical services contracts?
Thank you for the question. So I'd like to start with number one. After that tragic event, we worked very closely, or I worked very closely with the U.S. Border Patrol to ensure that number one, individuals that had pre-existing medical conditions and family units were got out of our custody as quickly as possible, right? So first and foremost, as you know, we don't have long-term detention capabilities. Second of all, we looked at the entire process to determine where the gaps are and what we needed to fix. So as far as the contract with the medical service, which is in the competitive stage right now, we turned that contract for the integrity of the contract to the Department of Homeland Security, who is now doing that process. But we also looked at the entirety of the process and how we care for individuals. Number one, we defined a seminal event. Number two, we hired government personnel for contract oversight so that we had more contract oversight. Number three, we defined medical at-risk individuals, and we ensured that they were identified and that information was being passed from shift to shift, watch commander to watch commander from the U.S. Border Patrol. Number four, we made changes to our system to ensure that it was appropriately flagging those individuals that were at risk. And five, we made changes to ensure that we were appropriately passing that information to the healthcare system and the folks that were passing those, or those people were getting sent to for that medical care.
Recognizing there's a substantial National Park Service managed land along both our land borders, are you aware if there's any data to show that illegal entries are higher or lower on lands that have a threat of apex predators?
I am not aware of any data. I would like to, if I could, we have for the first time, back to your first point, for the first time in a long time, we've started hiring directly into the northern border sectors. Number two, I think in the area you're talking about, in the Cascade region, is that correct?
North Cascades. Yeah.
Very few Border Patrol agents out in that area, as you know. We do have we have sensors, and we do train the sensors on threats to agents and some of those things with artificial intelligence, machine learning, which obviously in this case, we would do that. And as far as the crossings up in that particular area, I'd have to get back to you.
Well, I'm wondering if the Park Service aim to support a whole-of-government approach, maybe, to secure the border and disincentivize illegal immigration on the northern border with the threat of predators like wolves and grizzly bears. Maybe that's what they meant by catering to visitors who seek to experience grizzly bears in their native habitat, just guessing. Did the Park Service or Fish and Wildlife Service consult with or notify CBP before deciding to airdrop these predators into the backyard of agents at the Colville, Curlew, or Orville stations?
Not to my knowledge.
I didn't think so. In remote locations, I don't think it's uncommon for agents to respond to illegal activity by themselves. And as you said, there's not that many agents up there to begin with. They may be the only agent for dozens of miles. Among other concerns, I believe a legitimate one is agent safety because of this decision. Do CBP training protocols include how to address a threat to life and safety posed by a large, potentially aggressive wild animal like a bear? And how does CBP equip agents with the resources necessary to defend themselves just in case they are attacked by an aggressive grizzly bear?
We do have training in those remote locations for things like mountain lions and grizzly bears. Believe it or not, we do get the training from the Park Service and the spray, the firearms and the like. That they will defend themselves.
Well,
the agents will.
I would suggest that you step up that training and make it available to the folks up in Washington.
We will.
Yeah, thank you.
I see your budget has a lack of funding for new autonomous systems at ports of entry. Can you speak to why, when we know that technology is critical, we've helped to deploy much of that over the past few years, that you're prioritizing traditional manpower over some of these force multiplier systems?
So we need both. We all know that the sequencing of this budget year was a little bit difficult, so we certainly need additional technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning in particular at our ports of entry as we go after the fentanyl problem.
Well, we will continue to make that a priority in our office to make those investments. We understand how important they are to you. Thank you, Commissioner.
In looking at the budget, it appears like that the president has requested a $3 million decrease in the CBP budget. Is that correct?
Actually, the numbers are, I believe there's a tad bit increase in the overall budget, so if you
As
look.
far as the discretionary though for CBP, and taking out this contingency funds, slush fund, whatever you want to call it, just the baseline funding for CBP is roughly a $3 billion decrease from what CBP received in FY '24. Is that accurate or close to accurate, Commissioner?
The delta is accounted for in the contingency
All
fund.
right, and again, taking out the contingency fund.
So it's essentially the same.
The same funding, so there's not a, again, if there is no contingency fund, there is level funding, then there is not a $3 billion decrease for CBP?
No, I would still need the fund, the border
Yeah, and-
funds.
Yeah, and I'm not saying you don't need it, I'm just
Yeah,
saying what's
yes.
requested. Look,
Yeah.
I understand you need it, and I want to give it to you, but I want to put it in your base budget, so, but I just
Yes.
want, I just want to be clear that the numbers we're working on that have been submitted, not necessarily by you, but by the administration, show a $3 billion baseline decrease for CBP versus any increase. And I know that you were vocal, that you supported the Senate legislation that was being proposed. And in that legislation, as I recall, there was actually going to be $6.8 billion in additional funding for CBP. Would have hired 1,500 new agents, would have been an increase to the number of ICE, 1,500 new CBP agents, would have increased the number of ICE agents, and there would have been increases in technology, in your budget for technology. But that money that you supported then, it's not contained in this budget, right? There's no $6.8 billion increase for CBP. There's no, I think there's 300 or 350 new agents, but there's not 1,500 additional agents. And so the additional funding that you supported in the Senate, the president chose not to include that in his budget. Is that correct?
So I misunderstood your first question. So yes, essentially, there's $2.7 billion in the contingency fund that we feel we need that money, so wherever it is placed,
Yeah.
we need it.
And I want to put it in your baseline budget. I want you to have that money, and I'm not advocating, and I don't want you to believe that I'm up here. Matter of fact, I want you to have more money than that.
They process them, they take them to a processing center, but let's say this individual is not in any system that you have. There's no biometrics on them, no ID, no documents. How does CBP handle that person? You don't know who they are. How do you handle that?
Well, thank you for the question, and it's good to see you again likewise. We had this conversation a second ago, but so number one, we would like to take everything we do away from the border. So I think it's vitally important that we continue an understanding that we don't have information sharing agreements with all countries. We would like to share information with our colleagues throughout this hemisphere, South America, Central America, and we do. We would like to share biographic data, biometric data, and counter.
But the question is, sir, what do you do when they don't and you can't? You have no idea who this individual is. What are you going to do with them?
Well, again, that's what I'm trying to explain. So as they come through the hemisphere and that information's collected, we have those information sharing agreements. Our goal is to run that individual against all databases we have.
Okay, and there's nothing there.
any-
I'm jumping ahead for you. There's nothing there. You can look at all your systems, you can process them all you want. There's nothing there. You don't know who this individual is. What are you going to do with him?
So I would go back to the conversation we just had. My preference is.
I'm sorry I wasn't here.
No, with Mr. Guest. My preference is the migration continuum, all the agencies within, whether it's Customs and Border Protection, ICE, Citizenship and Immigration Services are funded appropriately with the appropriate authorities, and that we're able to detain individuals that don't have a legitimate asylum claim and remove them. We do not have long-term detention capabilities in Customs and Border Protection, nor should we. We need to get our agents back in between the ports of entry where they belong, doing the law enforcement mission, and give them all the available information as quickly as possible to make the appropriate decision with that
Okay, so you're
individual
telling me
that's
that
in
these
front of them.
individuals are gonna be detained?
I said that's my preference.
Okay,
My preference is that they are detained. If we do not have the capacity to detain them, we cannot.
then why in the world would they ask to cut detention beds?
I'm here representing Customs and Border Protection, sir.
I know. Okay.
And so with that, I want to thank the members for being here today, and committee stands adjourned.